Hello everyone, Vincent Teo from HDTV Test here. I'm a TV reviewer and professional calibrator. Today I'm spending some time with the massive 77-inch A1 OLED television, and as you can see by the sheer size here, I'm not actually joking that this is truly a beast of a television. Now, there are many other OLED manufacturers on the market, but what Sony is strong at in terms of their A1 or A1E in the USA, Bravia OLED, is their video processing. And again, today when I tested this television, I saw many evidence of how Sony, their engineering team, in terms of their video processing, try to do certain things certain way to clean up the signal. So one thing that you probably will note, and I've actually touched on this many times before, is their smooth gradation technology. So what it is basically a super bitmapping technology that tries to reduce the amount of banding and polarization in less than pristine sources. But if you feed even a high quality source such as the 4K Blu-ray of The Martian to this television, even without the help of smooth gradation, you can see that the sky in the background, I can already see that it is actually exhibiting less contouring or polarization than competing sets from other manufacturers. But if you actually turn on smooth gradation, it can actually smooth out the gradients even further, resulting in a really clean looking, really silky smooth image. And the thing with smooth gradation is that it is not without its downsides. But when I tested lots of content on the Bravia OLED, the only instance where I can find that the smooth gradation actually scrub away some fine detail is in this scene from Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, where there are various white tiles in the roof. And if you turn on smooth gradation, even on the low setting, it will subtly erase away the distinction between the tiles. But that is just one instance that I managed to find, really rare, on this Sony television. And other attributes at which Sony excels is their motion processing, and even without the help of motion flow, you can see that in the scene from Wall-E where there's a spaceship traveling across the galaxy, the movement is very cinematic and filmic. And if you want, you can actually engage Sony's motion flow technology to try and smooth out motion even further. And this can be useful, let's say, in this clip from Planet Earth, where there's a fox chasing a creature across these rocks here. And without the help of motion flow, you can see that it judders and blurs quite severely. But with the help of motion flow, it makes the footage much more tolerable. And the strength of Sony's motion flow system has always been, if you actually engage it, it actually incurs less soap opera effect or SOE to 24 frames per second movies, and it incurs less interpolation artifacts than competing systems from other manufacturers. But still, as a purist, I will always go to true cinema if I'm watching a movie. Now let me just go back one step and talk about motion resolution. With this test pattern here, you can see that there are various lines that are actually scrolling from right to left. And with motion flow switched off, or if it is in true cinema mode, the baseline motion resolution is only 300 lines, which is expected from a sample and hold display like the Sony Bravia A1 OLED. But if you engage motion flow, you can get up to 650 lines. And there is a black frame insertion function on this television. You can activate it by setting clearness to high, but it is generally not suitable for most viewers because there will be some dimness and especially flicker at 50 Hz frame rate. So I think most people will be put off by the flicker. But the option is there on this TV. If you can tolerate the flicker, certainly it may be a useful function. And if you decide not to go with black frame insertion or BFI and just use motion interpolation to try and boost the motion resolution, the Sony A1 OLED is capable of going to 650 lines. But to achieve that, you will have to actually incur some soap opera effect or SOE. The Sony Bravia A1 OLED also cleans up near black noise better than other TV brands on the market. So if you look at this scene in Skyfall as Javier Bardem is walking towards the chapel, or this clip from Father Brown, the macro blocking in the background is better suppressed on the Sony A1 OLED, including the 77-inch version, than, let's say, the OLEDs from other manufacturers. And one way Sony has tried to do this is actually by creating a slight ramp from black to dark gray, so that the blacks actually look slightly shallower than competing OLEDs from other manufacturers. But they say that by trying to do it in this manner, they can actually get a smoother gradation near black when coming out of black. And also it helps with the self-adjustment or compensation cycle of these televisions. Let's talk about scaling. You can see from this SMPD RP133 test pattern, which is displayed at 576i, the letters remain fairly sharp without introducing excessive ringing. And I always believe that the X1 Extreme chipset from Sony performs the best in TV upscaling this year. But when you apply it to such a large screen, 77-inch, and you're trying to scale a standard definition signal to the screen, naturally it will look blurrier than, let's say, a 65-incher or let's say a 55-incher. But you should just adopt an appropriate viewing distance from this 77-inch A1 OLED. So we've covered video processing and we've covered motion. And let's talk about the real dilemma that is faced by potential purchasers of OLED television. The first thing is the vertical banding in, let's say, really dark scenes. And this panel, when we displayed a gray slide that is just above black, you can see that there's multiple vertical streaks and there's some reverse vignetting, which means that the sides are slightly brighter than the center. But this is not out of the ordinary for WRGB OLED that is applied by LG Display. I can't complain that I'm seeing many of these artifacts in real-life content. And the second issue is in terms of color uniformity. Now, some OLED owners, especially those who own 65-inch OLED televisions this year, they are complaining that a part of their picture, usually on the left side, is tinted, maybe yellow. But we displayed a full field white from, let's say, 50% stimulus to 100% stimulus on this 77A1, and we can't really see that there's anything that would actually bother us in real-life content. Obviously, when you look at it, scrutinize it, there's a slight blue tint down the left side. But when displaying real-life content, I just don't really see it being a problem, at least on this particular sample. And the third issue is image retention or screen burn. Now, many people are worried about the propensity of OLED being a self-emissive display to actually suffer from image retention or even permanent screen burn. Now, all I can say is, being a self-emissive display, these pixels are used at different rate. So if you display a static logo for too long, then naturally it will burn. Now, the question is whether if you just use it normally, or if you play games, let's say not more than 4 or 5 hours a day, how much damage can you cause? The thing with these OLEDs, because they are supplied by LG Display, and I've been speaking to them, to their engineers, we know that when these TVs, when they go into standby, they perform a compensation cycle to self-adjust or self-calibrate these pixels that are being used at different rates. So there will be a self-calibration or compensation cycle going on upon standby after you accumulate a certain number of hours of operation. But from my experience, and speaking to many other technical reviewers, like my good friend and colleague David McKenzie, who owns an LG 65-inch C7 now, this is much less of an issue than, let's say, plasmas from 4 or 5 years ago. Even the final generation of plasma, they are showing lots of image retention and screen burn. And these OLED TVs are certainly much more resistant. And manufacturers and also the panel manufacturer, by panel manufacturer, I mean LG Display themselves, they have some guided protocol to try and counteract this issue. So I think if you let your TV do its compensation cycle automatically, put them into standby, don't actually unplug the TV from your mains power. If you do that, then the compensation cycle won't run. If you let the TV go into standby and run its own compensation cycle, then I really don't think that image retention or screen burn is an issue. Just as a footnote, when I was doing my Apple TV SDR output versus HDR output comparison, I was actually trying very hard, trying my best to burn the HDR OLED so that I can actually tell you that if you let your Apple TV 4K box output as HDR, there might be more risk of screen burn. But I tried my best to actually burn it and it still didn't happen. I couldn't capture any image that showed that it's actually burning. So the compensation cycle, I'm not saying that it's 100% foolproof, but it does work to a certain extent. And overall, I think in the grand scheme of things, these OLED TVs are much less susceptible to permanent screen burn or image retention than, let's say, the likes of plasmas or CRT. So those are the 3 issues covered. Now let's talk about the high dynamic range capabilities of this Sony 77-inch A1 OLED. Peak brightness came in at 725 nits on a 10% window and 160 nits full fill, which is in line with how the ABL or automatic brightness limiter algorithm works on the 2017 Sony OLED. And in terms of DCI-P3 color gamut coverage, I measured it around 95%, which is slightly lower than the 98 or 99% that is seen on the smaller screen sizes. But in real life content, I really couldn't see too much of a difference. The inky blacks of OLED still acts as an ideal canvas for the colors to really pop, to take on this depth and dimensionality that is rarely seen on transmissive displays. And as you are probably well aware, currently the Sony Bravia A1 OLED supports HDR10, which is the open standard that is used in 4K Blu-ray and also Netflix 4K and Amazon Video. And it also supports HLG, which is hybrid log gamma, the open standard for broadcast that is developed by the BBC and the NHK. And Dolby Vision is on its way. So I asked Sony, when is Dolby Vision going to arrive on these Sony televisions with the X1 Extreme chipset that has been promised since CES? And the answer I got from them was actually fairly positive. So they are not telling me when it's arriving, but they are telling me that in December, which is in maybe a couple of weeks' time, they will be able to announce a confirmed arrival date for the Dolby Vision firmware update. They took the opportunity to show me a working Dolby Vision firmware on the Sony A1. And I know it's still probably in beta, but it is there, and you can see that upon receipt of a Dolby Vision signal, the TV kicks into a Dolby Vision HDR mode. So there's only one mode for Dolby Vision, unlike HDR10, where if you feed a HDR10 signal to a 2017 Sony Bravia television, you can still select between different picture presets such as Cinema Pro, Cinema Home, Game, Vivid, Standard, and so on and so forth. But if you send a Dolby Vision signal to the Sony Bravia A1 OLED on this particular firmware, you are locked into the Dolby Vision mode. And I actually went into the menu to try and find out if there's anything new. You can adjust the white balance. There's still no color management system as with all Sony televisions to date. And it is interesting to find that the extended dynamic range has been replaced by a peak luminance option, and you can set it to either low, medium or high, which sets the light output of the television, and I see no reason to actually deviate from high really. But otherwise, most of the menu structure is the same as other picture presets, and yeah, I've seen it working, and I was shown some demo Dolby Vision content, and they look really fantastic with the appropriate preservation of both the specular highlight detail and also the darker end of the picture. So certainly it looked really good, but Sony tells me there's still some work to do, and it's not easy to try and integrate the Dolby Vision algorithm with their own Sony X1 Extreme chipset. So there's still some work to do. But yes, in December, in next week or even a couple of weeks time, Sony will be able to tell us when Dolby Vision will be arriving on these TVs with the X1 Extreme chipset, which includes the Sony ZD9 or Z9D, the Sony XE93 or X930E, the Sony XE94 or X940E, and this Sony Bravia A1 or A1E OLED. So that's Dolby Vision. It's coming. It's definitely coming. And I played some HDR10 content on this Sony Bravia A1 OLED, and it's performed similarly to the 65-inch A1 that I reviewed some time ago. So it tries to maintain as much of the tone curve, as much of the brightness as possible before rolling off. As I've explained before in my tone mapping video, trying to tone map a HDR signal with a high peak brightness to a display with a lower peak brightness usually involves trying to balance between maintaining specular highlight detail and maintaining overall brightness. If you try to maintain all the specular highlight detail and the bright information, then you have to lower the overall brightness or average picture level, APL, correspondingly. And Sony's approach and Sony's philosophy is that both are equally important. There is no established standard for tone mapping anyway, but what Sony is always trying to do is to try and maintain the director's or creator's intention. So in their opinion, the overall brightness is as important as specular highlight detail, and if you maintain overall brightness, you can create a consistent viewing experience across all scenes rather than trying to preserve specular highlight detail, which may be very rare in the movie but affect the rest of the movie. So what the Sony X1 Extreme chipset does is to ignore the metadata on the disc itself. It will generate its own metadata on the fly, but even then, it's not going to try and maintain all the specular highlight detail, because Sony's belief is that overall picture brightness is as important. And therefore, you can see that in this scene from Pacific Rim, the clouds in the sky is losing some detail. If you lower the contrast to try and restore this specular highlight detail, then the overall picture will look much darker. And in Sony's opinion, this would subvert the creator's intention. Also in this scene from Mad Max, where there's lightning in the background, if you set advanced contrast enhancer to low, you can actually restore a bit of the lightning. But from speaking to Sony engineers, they are of the belief that advanced contrast enhancer should be switched off for the most accurate reproduction of the director's intention. So we have covered Dolby Vision, we have covered HDR10. I'm not going to talk much about HLG because there's really no HLG content at this moment in time, but this TV is certainly compatible with HLG format. And we've covered motion, we've covered video processing, and let's talk about gaming. So I measured the input lag on this 77-inch Bravia A1 OLED, and as expected from an X1 Extreme chipset, the input lag in 1080p SDR mode is 47 milliseconds. But if you actually send a 4K signal to the television, the input lag can be lowered to around 31 milliseconds, basically lowering it by 1 frame. So again, confirming this with Sony engineers, the scaling process that is performed by the X1 Extreme chipset will add 1 frame of lag to your games. So whenever possible, try to send this TV a 4K signal from your PS4 Pro, your Xbox One S and Xbox One X. They will do that automatically anyway, but just be wary just in case. Right, so I've covered most of the picture side of things. Now, one thing that I haven't really touched on in my previous video is how good the acoustic surface technology on this television is. Now, as you know, you can see from this TV itself, the entire screen is in the front. There's no speakers at the bottom, and the entire screen basically acts as a speaker powered by transducer at the back. And I haven't actually emphasized just how good this acoustic surface system is. So this is a scene from the movie Arrival, and there are various newscasters appearing on screen at different parts of the image. And when they speak, if you actually sit in a chair and if you shut your eyes, you can precisely pinpoint where the newscaster is actually speaking from. Which part of the screen does the voice belong to? And this is really quite fantastic, because by using the entire screen as a, how shall I put it, as a platform for the sound to be transmitted, it allows for such a precise pinpoint localization of these vocal voices. It is a truly fantastic technology, and it's not as if the bass is lacking either. It has really quite substantial bass, especially if you pump up the volume quite a lot. So I like to describe the sound as very full-bodied, like a vintage bottle of Chateau Neuf du Pape, and with such crystal clearness that it's just like the Riedel wine glass that holds the wine. Fantastic, really, truly fantastic technology. So 77-inch Bravia A1 OLED, picture top-notch, sound top-notch, both working in symphony, so I call it a symphony of picture and sound. And the price is not cheap. It runs around £20,000, and you can buy it immediately from select retailers. But what you really get is a truly fantastic and immersive viewing experience that is both rich in terms of the picture and in terms of the sound as well. If you found this video useful, please click the like button and subscribe to the HDTV Test YouTube channel for more videos like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you the next time.